Right, okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tony Hines, and I'm the chair of the Northwest Organisational Research Society Group. And before I get started, I just want to read out a few housekeeping matters. Please keep all microphones muted during the talk. You can use the chat function to make comments and note any questions that you want to ask of the speaker. After the presentation, we'll have about 30 minutes for live questions, and I'll invite you to switch on your microphone and ask the question directly to our speaker. And if you want to say anything about today's event on Twitter, please use the hashtag NWORG Decarbon, and that should keep them all together. So, we're very pleased to welcome everyone to today's meeting, which is about modelling UK pathways to decarbonisation. And it's very topical, just ahead of the COP26 in Glasgow. And we're very pleased and honoured to have Alec Waterhouse, who is the head of Central Modelling Team in the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. His team are responsible for working out how much greenhouse gas is emitted. And he and his colleagues develop a range of models taking into account the effect of government policies and a host of other stuff to get those models working to meet the long-term goals on energy policy. Alec started his working life getting fed up of being wet and dirty, he says, as he moved into operational research, worked on a variety of organizational tasks, ranging from retailing to, is that publishing, I can see? And the IPCC report has been timely as well, with just 11 and a half years to this tipping point that everybody talks about. So I think Alec's going to give us some insights this afternoon to how he and his team actually take this modelling of decarbonisation forward to help us all decarbonise. So over to you, Alec, if that's okay.
Yeah, thank Tony.
Yep.
And let me know if you can't hear me.
Just a bit of pinging at the moment.
You can.
Yeah.
So you can see that now, everybody?
Yep, I can hear you now, Alec.
Lovely. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you today. As Tony said, my name's Alec Waterhouse, and I head up the central modelling team within the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Been a member of the Operational Research Society for many years, and I was delighted and very pleased when Barry Daniels reached out and asked me to speak today. And I hope you'll find it interesting and thought-provoking. But what I'm going to be talking about is modelling decarbonisation pathways. And this is very much a personal view. So as always with speaking on behalf of government, anything that I say is my own view and shouldn't be necessarily taken as representing what the government of the day actually thinks or is going to do or is going to talk about or anything like that. So just move the slides on. So just a bit about what the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy is for. It's mostly what it says on the outside of the tin. So there's business, looking at how we can promote and support the economy of the UK. Industrial strategy, a stronger focus on how we continue to develop and become, remain one of the leading industrial nations in the world. Science, research and innovation, we hold that portfolio for government as well. But the two bits that when we merged from becoming the Department of Energy and Climate Change and the Department of Business, Innovation and Skills, the two bits that were missed off the end because the name got far too long were energy and clean growth and climate change. And that's the bit that I think is probably one of the most important things, certainly for us all as citizens of the world and citizens on the planet, talking about reducing our carbon footprint. And all of you will have seen in the news the various adverse events that are going on around the world that are bringing it much closer to home, the need to decarbonise the world as a whole. And I'll talk a little bit about what we're doing in the UK to help policy development in that sphere. So as build, we'll talk a bit about the agenda for today. Is I'm going to talk a little bit about carbon budgets, just to set the scene, a little bit about the suite of models that we actually use, and then major on the UK Times, which is in all my practice as an operational researcher, it was the first time that I've ever used a linear program in practice to actually do something useful and interesting. Anyway, so moving on, the Climate Change Act was set out in 2008, and we still are one of the few nations in the world that has a extremely clear legal framework for setting out emissions reductions in the UK. So the original Climate Change Act set out the greenhouse reduction levels of 80% cuts by 2050 against our 1990 emissions levels. And when I talk about carbon emissions, what we normally use, I'll use the word interchangeably, when we're talking about greenhouse gases really here, and greenhouse gases are a basket of gases. So methane, for example, is a greenhouse gas. Carbon dioxide is itself, and there are many others that contribute towards the sort of effects that we've got. So what we tend to do is talk about everything in carbon dioxide. So, for example, methane is has more effect on greenhouse as a global warming gas, is much more powerful than carbon dioxide. Anyway, we have a lookup table that tells you how to convert everything into the equivalence of tons of carbon dioxide. Anyway, so that was the original plan. The way that it's managed is that we have legislated 5-year carbon budget periods that are set 3 budget periods in advance. So they're legislated by the government of the day, and they set out the actual emissions that our country has to drop to, right, moving towards what was in 2008, 80% cuts by 2050. At the same time, the governments of the day set up a independent committee on climate change, now called the Climate Change Committee. And their role is to provide scrutiny of government and hold the government to account for its achievements or otherwise on carbon budgets. But more importantly, in this context, they have a role for recommending to the government of the day what the next carbon budget should be. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So after the setting of the first Climate Change Act, in 2017, the net zero strategy was actually set up. So in 2019, we'd actually agreed to change our long-term target from being 90% reduction to complete decarbonisation. And net zero in that context doesn't necessarily mean that the UK is not going to emit any carbon dioxide, but that we have technologies and processes for mopping up any residual emissions, so that on balance we are actually net zero. And that was published. So we published the Green Growth Strategy, and then we've set the emissions, net zero emissions were passed into law. So just a little bit more about carbon budgets. If you're interested, you can pick up one of the functions of my team is we make projections of what we believe the energy demand of the UK is going to be out to the end of the carbon budgets that we see in the future. And also we then work out and try and establish what the effect of all of the climate change policies that are in place is going to have in terms of our emissions. So we project forward energy demand and emissions. And on this screen, you can see on the right hand side of the screen, in our reports, you can pick these up, they're freely available on the public domain. They're called the energy and emissions projections, and they look forward at what the carbon budgets are, which are the very dark blue bars on the screen. And then we have outturn projections or outturn actuals. So for example, we've achieved the first carbon budget, that's a matter of record now. And you can look at what we think we're going to do for the fourth carbon budget there. And on our last projections, you can see that the range of uncertainty is still not meeting the carbon budget. And what that means is that government of the day, our governments and future ones that are to come, have got more work to do to set out policies and frameworks to actually decarbonise the economy in order to meet that. So many, as it says on the tin there, on the slide, many policies that will affect things later on haven't been developed. And what we're doing is saying just how much needs to be developed before we get to the next, before we get to the carbon budget and have to meet it. So a bit about the Committee on Climate Change. And again, their reports are comprehensive and very well thought out. And what they do is they recommend the level of the carbon budget, and basically civil servants, that's myself and my colleagues, actually look at that level, review it, and are advising the government of the day whether or not it's technically feasible. As yet, we've never ever gone back to it and said we don't believe that this is possible, and we've accepted all of the recommendations on the way through, and it was no different with the sixth carbon budget. So we advise the minister, then that budget is set into law. And as we speak, we are writing the next step that's actually set out in law, is that we actually are then required to set out the strategy that the government will adopt in order to meet the sixth carbon budget. You'll see on this chart in front of us that that this budget is different in that the little hatched areas on the chart were for aviation and shipping, and now those have actually been in international aviation and shipping, and they've now been included in the carbon budgets themselves, which has made it even more stretching to achieve the sixth carbon budget. So we really do have our work cut out as an economy. So let's just have a quick, so that's setting the scene for carbon budgets. A quick overview of our modelling suite. This schematic shows, in a way, all you need to know about the modelling suite. The orange lozenge on the side is the set of inputs that we use to our models. Many of those in and of themselves are models. For example, when we are looking at energy demand, we use we need to know how the economy is going to grow or otherwise in the future, and we use projections of the economy, growth in the economy, from the Office of Budget Responsibility. You won't be surprised to know that domestic energy demand is strongly dependent on the number of households or on the number of people in the UK, and again they rely on projections of population and numbers of households. Non-domestic demand, again, for industry and commerce, relies on knowing something about the way that the economy is going to grow and change as well. So many of the inputs that we use are actually in and of themselves reliant on models. So that's talking about the inputs. We'll talk about the long-term pathways bit, which is the UK Times bit. That is the place where we hold and look at long-term strategic implications of the way that the UK is going to decarbonise. One of the facets of the model, and you'll understand why that is that it requires a knowledge of some idea of what we think the demand for energy is going to be. And we've just spoken about the energy and emissions projections model. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And that set of projections of energy demand drives a lot of the thought for the models that we have of both the supply side, that is things like power generation, and the demand side, that is domestic and non-domestic energy consumption. And we have discrete models for each of those sectors that look at how each of those sectors behaves under a variety of scenarios, decarbonisation scenarios. I should also say that this isn't just the domain of business, energy and industrial strategy. And indeed, one of the joys and pleasures of working with across government is that we deal with all of the other major government departments that are actually working on decarbonisation policy. So that's Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, the Housing Department, whose name is just changed and it's escaping me, Department for Transport. Those are the primary groups that are thinking about how we go about decarbonising those sectors of the economy. And what it's proved to be really, really important is keeping in very, very close contact with not only the groups that are modelling sectors of the economy within our organisation, but those groups that are modelling transport and agriculture and land use throughout the rest of the civil service, because aligning the assumptions and the inputs is really, really important when it comes to producing an overall comprehensive UK strategy. We talked a bit about the energy and emissions projections, and in and of themselves, they're reliant on three models. So they are, so this is fundamental. So just run through 2 or 3 of the models. We've got energy and emissions are projections that are produced by a econometric model, which is effectively a very posh name for a linear regression of future demand. And some of the variables that it takes into account are the state of the economy, we think in the future, temperature, so we're using data from the Met Office projections into the future about how cold the winters are going to be, well, how warm the winters are going to be and what the summers are going to be like, because that has a material effect on demand. We take into account the effect of changes in particular policies, such as insulation of homes or decarbonisation of industry. Energy demand is elastic to price, so we take into account fuel and carbon prices, and much of what we do is projecting forward, uses knowledge of how energy demand has behaved in the past. So we start off with a demand model. We know that energy demand is then characterised by demand for different sorts of energy, electricity being one of those. And electricity actually really affects the amount of electricity demand actually affects the price. So once we've worked out what the demands are, we can work out how the electricity demand is going to be satisfied, how we believe electricity demand is going to be satisfied. Once we know that, we can work out what the price of the energy is likely to be in the future, faced by consumers. And then we recalculate the energy demand and keep on going around the loop until the system actually is in equilibrium. And at that point, we press the stop button and publish our model. It's all a bit more complicated than that, but you get the picture. So we mentioned this dynamic dispatch model. Well, what's that? Well, it's actually a model of electricity supply. So it models electricity generation and makes investment decisions. So it has a series of understanding of what demand levels might be for winter, summer, and shoulder seasons. And then it has an investment algorithm that works out what types of plant to build, what types of plant to retire. And in this case, we use it to model how the electricity is going to be produced and therefore what the price is. But it's used for a whole bunch of other things. So we look at how the wholesale market, the capacity market, which are all the various markets that are used to buy and sell electricity and keep supply in equilibrium with demand, and understand how carbon policies will work in the future. We call these models and others, we call them foundation models because we use them for so many different things. And we spend a lot of time making sure that they're up to date, they're well looked after, they're assured, etc. We talked again, the third bit on this was trying to work out what the price was. I won't bore you too much with the detail, but we're actually trying to work out from a variety of inputs such as from the dynamic dispatch model, which we discussed, other areas that look at fossil fuel prices, carbon prices, etc. We can work out what the wholesale price of electricity might be, what the cost of actually transmitting it through the network is, how policy costs are spread across to the consumer, and how they are then also add things like VAT, etc. added in. We then work out what multiply up the price per unit by the consumption, and we can work out what the final bill is to the UK, and that can be fed back into our overall energy and emissions model. So I hope you're getting the picture that what we're doing is a reasonably comprehensive overview of how the energy and emission system of the UK works, and these are just some of the models that we actually use. When we're thinking about individual policies, one of the things that I'm particularly proud of is something called the National Buildings Model. It's got the word model twice there, sorry about that. And what that is a micro simulation of how individual dwellings will use energy. It's got it's got the model of the physics of the property inside it, and that's linked up to our knowledge through statistical surveys of the housing types. So through that, we can attempt to understand what the effect is of changes to the way that houses are heated, the way that they're insulated, and we can use that to understand the effect of particular policies, and we can also use it to understand how energy demand might change over time. So we've got here, just the schematic shows you that we've got a set of housing stock that comes from things like the English Housing Survey. We use that inside the National Household Model, the National Buildings Model application. That it's a language that's now being rewritten from top to bottom in Python, and it basically you can just model it. And if you're interested, you can go and download a copy of the model from the web. It's freely available. The new version will be coming out on Git, but you can get the old version anytime you like. Okay, so that's a bit about the National Housing Model. And if you're really interested and you want to have a play God yourself, you can have a go with the Makai carbon calculator, which is a model of a personal model of how you could decarbonize the economy. So you can, if you pick the one in the middle, the web tool, you could actually press on a whole bunch of levers to see what your personal preference is for how you might go about decarbonising the economy. The hyperlinks are actually on the screen. So moving swiftly on, I shouldn't stop here without actually saying that our department has a really comprehensive approach to quality assurance. All of the models that we use are quality assured to make sure that they're well documented, they're clear, they've been verified and validated, that the data assumptions are all logged, and we actually produce a score that produces a score out of 100 for how well each model meets the overall assurance standards that we have. Again, these are all available on the internet. If you haven't come across something, we recommend you reading the AQUA book, which stands for the Analytical Quality Assurance Book, which is the government's view on how to quality assure analysis. And then you can look at BEI's quality assurance processes, which are again all available on the internet. So if you're interested in assuring models or approaches to assuring models, then you could do a lot worse than looking at the AQUA book and looking at how BEI's actually does that in practice. So moving on, we talked about the overall process of in that schematic of looking at the UK decarbonisation profiles, and what we use is a linear program called UK Time, or called Times, and I'm now going to spend a little bit of time talking about that. I have to say that the Committee on Climate Change do a fantastic job. One of the things that we're doing is effectively looking at the methodology that they're using a different methodology to assess the recommendations that they've actually been making. So they don't use times. We're the ones who are using it to look at it, and it is a linear program. So what is it? So that's the UK Times model. It's a least cost optimizer. It's long term. We set the model out to 2060 at the moment. So that's beyond the 2050 target date for decarbonising our economy. And the reason why we do that is, I'm sure many of you are familiar with linear programs, is that because it has what's known as perfect foresight, and if it believes the world's going to cut, if the model, I'm using anthropomorphic terms here, but if the model believes that the world's going to end at 2050, it then adopts some rather strange behaviour because it starts to do things like scrap all of its technologies the day before it thinks the world's going to end. So we run it on a bit longer in order to be able to make sure that those edge effects aren't actually don't make any difference to the kind of things that we're doing. So it's technology rich inside, and we'll talk a bit more about how it's technology rich. What it's trying to do is to make available to the energy system of the UK a whole bunch of technologies that either exist now or that exist now, and those are all available to the algorithm to select those. So we'll talk about what the objective function is, but effectively the objective function is trying to minimize the overall energy, so the overall cost of providing energy to the UK, subject to quite a lot of constraints. So it models in a quite coarse time span, so it models in 5-year periods, and it has 16 time slices that we'll talk a bit more about in a minute. So it models different time slices for how energy gets used within peak and off-peak times, and in winter and summer, etc. The way that it's calibrated and set up at the moment, it's modeled by sector, and we were talking about aligning the lower levels sector models with the UK Times model. And one of the important things that Times does is it basically keeps score of what each of those sectoral models are doing, because sometimes the sectoral models, when you're operating them, don't take into account things that would happen elsewhere in the system as a consequence of what you've done. So it kind of keeps a whole score of that. It models the end use sectors, and it basically deals with things called energy service demands, and those come from our emission energy projections. And what we're interested in is the energy demand. So we measure energy in joules. So you'll notice that we're not actually saying how that energy is going to be supplied, whether it's through electricity, heat networks, gas of whatever sort. What we're saying is that there's a requirement for energy, and we don't say what form that energy should take. So again, we'd said it relies on a whole bunch of inputs. If you're interested in energy, commend to you something called the Digest of UK Energy Statistics, fondly known as UK Dukes. We calibrate our model to both that and something called the UK Greenhouse Gas Inventory, again, which you can draw down from the internet. And we're balancing and calibrating the initial starting point of our model. It's such a big and hairy model at the moment that it's very, very time consuming to calibrate the model. So we've left the calibration at 2010 for a long time. Possibly that's something that we should update. It also, as I said, requires energy consumption, knowledge of housing, or knowledge of it uses greenhouse gas. There's a whole bunch of things that go into it. I won't bore you with the details. Simplified now, we've got a bunch of resources, so coal, gas, wind, etc. Those are turned into vectors that transmit the primary energy from the source through a energy vector into each of those sectors, so residential, service, industry, transport and agriculture, and they satisfy the end user demands that we talked about. What's the model do? It's trying to minimize the total cost of that system throughout time. So it will give us a total cost of the system. It will work out what the emissions are for each sector by year. It works out what technologies are going to be deployed, and you can see here that there are upwards, well, about 1,500 technologies in there. So, for example, it's got a knowledge of how wind farms or electric vehicles or solid wall insulation or building heat pumps or nuclear power stations. And each of those technologies are available to the algorithm. What the algorithm is doing is looking at the existing suite of ways of satisfying end user energy demand. It's got a constraint that says we've got carbon budgets in place and we need to be net zero by 2050. So that's a binding constraint. And what the algorithm is trying to do is to select the combination of technologies that will satisfy all of those constraints at minimum cost. So it kind of gets a little bit more complicated. So inside the model itself, after that this schematic, this kind of energy chain, supply chain is replicated all the way through the model. So it's showing you what the technologies actually are, what commodities are actually being consumed, what technologies are actually using each of those technologies, what technologies are then processing each of the commodities, and what end user sectors can actually use that. So we've got grass coming in, very simply, we've got grass going into a bioenergy supply chain here. That could either come from being imported or from domestic production. It's being pelletized, possibly turning into ethanol. Those commodities in themselves are going to be used in either gasification, so they could be turned into biodiesel, biokerosene, or biosynthetic natural gas. And each of those energy vectors in and of themselves are suitable for different end user demands. And those, the UK Times has a perfect foresight. It knows what demands required, and if the algorithm believes that selecting that particular technology is cheaper than any other combination of technologies, then that's what it'll choose. We talked about temporal dimensions. So there are, if you like, the modelling horizon has a set of peaks and troughs. You can see here that we've got night, day, winter. We've got summer, a typical summer, typical winter, and a typical day. And we model each of those sectors so that we can say that there are seasonal variations, annual variations, weekly in day variations within the model that it's trying to cope with. So what does Times actually do well? It tells us that what key technologies are important for reaching 2050 under a range of scenarios, and we'll talk a bit more about scenarios. It tells you broadly the order of actions that we need to take place to decarbonise the economy. So what should go first, what should go second. It tells us what emissions levels we would be expecting that are consistent with developing the technologies and what decarbonisation order we're going in. It gives us something that the Treasury are really, really keen on, how much it's going to cost compared with the counterfactual. And in this case, the counterfactual is a bit odd, really, because the do-nothing scenario isn't really a tenable option. So we're comparing this with the counterfactual that would say that we're not going to decarbonise our economy. And in and of itself, that would present a whole series of costs that actually aren't considered by this system at all. And it gives a whole system perspective, so it allows us to find out whether or not there are any accounting errors in our sectoral models or whether they'd be interacting adversely with one another. So a bunch of caveats, things that it doesn't do very well. So it doesn't account for uncertainty, so it's completely deterministic. I think that stands for itself. The choices that are made by the algorithm are really sensitive to cost and performance. We've got a large science and engineering community within government, and we do our best to make sure that we've got the best possible agreed views as to what we think future technology costs and performance actually are. Price shocks, etc. We're modelling over a very long period of time, so it's difficult to see. We might all be experiencing gas price shocks at the moment, but in the long run, they're pretty smooth. But we don't model individual price shocks during and how that might behave because of the granularity of the modelling system. The Times has perfect foresight, so there's no endogenous learning. So one of the key things is that we know that as technologies get deployed, and wind turbines are a fantastic example of that the price of generating electricity from wind turbines has dropped dramatically over time. And that's due to the learning by doing in the main. Now, if we were to put in that kind of behaviour inside Times, then it's likely that it has another problem in that it does something, even if the differences in two technologies are very, very small, it will select the one that's cheaper, even if it's by a fraction of a penny. And if, for example, there was likely to be a great deal more learning available to the slightly more expensive one, it would never get deployed. So we have to play some tunes on the model to actually make sure that it is taking into account what we believe technology cost reductions are going to be. The last bit, and this is quite hard to explain sometimes to our customer groups, that what we're not doing is producing forecasts. We're actually trying to understand the solution space that's open to the UK economy, and it just is, all it's trying to do is find the cheapest feasible solution in the space that we've determined using the supply and constraints. Finally, it's a techno-rational model, so it doesn't really capture the barriers to uptake. So if we identified, for example, that insulating our houses is a really great thing to do, but nobody in the UK wants to do it, there will have to be some further government action through incentivisation, regulation, taxation, whatever, in order to make that happen. And this actually isn't captured in this kind of model, the kind of behavioural aspects of that. So how does the modelling process work? So starting off, we're continuously building the evidence base, and at some point in time we freeze that and set that for the particular suite of runs that we've got. We develop the model, we construct it, we validate and verify it using our assurance processes. We have the big one in the middle is that we're reviewing and discussing both the inputs, aligning the assumptions and inputs that we're using in that large strategic model with all of the sectoral models to make sure that that what goes in is in accordance with the sectoral experts' views. And then we're running the model and showing them the outputs and saying that we're getting some face validation from that. So when we do this, we do many runs. So we're doing batch runs to relax or introduce constraints or changes to costs, whatever. We're doing things like knocking out particular technologies to see what happens and asking a whole bunch of what ifs. So we just keep on doing this over. So there's a lot of exploration of the solution space just to make sure, because as you know, linear programs are extremely sensitive to they're very much edge solutions, and what we're interested in is how sensitive the edge solution is to the constraints that we've set. So the homework question in this case was, is it technically feasible to reach the 6th carbon budget? What are the costs and benefits? As I said, it's a whole bunch of things that are uncertain. So we're interested in looking at the Committee on Climate Change, whether or not the level of the budget was about right. And we were looking at the not only the level, but what paths we might adopt in order to be able to reach that. So what technical alternatives are, what scope there was for delay, whether or not increasing, whether or not making more aggressive assumptions about technology development was important. And in the end, what we came up with was 3 main scenarios that actually explored most of the space, the solution space, or at least a lot of the solution space. One was looking at higher electrification. The higher electrification is really depending on heat pump deployment. It doesn't use a lot of hydrogen for for heating, and it's got high greenhouse gas capture rates, which allows you to keep on with some of the technologies that would be otherwise greenhouse gas emitting. The high innovation looks at has a lot of direct air capture in it. Direct air capture is where and storage is where we're actually sucking carbon dioxide out of the air. We have quite a lot of those around at the moment. They're called trees, but we were actually beefing this up with some technology, extra technology that actually hasn't been yet deployed at scale. We have increased the aviation ambition. One of the things that we know is that certainly humans seem to have a voracious appetite for aviation, and decarbonising aviation is going to be challenging. Our colleagues in the Department for Transport have now got some ideas about zero aviation fuels and the like, and building those into the system allows us to look at those options. And then with what we call the high resource system is actually putting in lots more. It's planting more trees and using the natural gas grid system, but repurposing it for delivering hydrogen instead of electrifying, so using hydrogen to heat homes. So those are the solutions that we've got, and the answer really is that yes, it's just about, we think it's just about technically feasible. We pretty much have to do everything that we can do, and quite a lot of what we think we can do. There's a really high reliance on electricity, on transferring over to hydrogen. So we're basically having to do everything and make sure that it's all successful all at the same time. Somebody said it was like a bit like putting on 12 Olympics back to back, one against each other, or 3 Olympics at the same time, one after another until we hit net zero. It's that kind of scale of effort. The Climate Change Committee in their analysis have been a lot more bullish on cost reduction, the speed and rollout of technologies, and they have a lot more behaviour change. So things about diet are in their technologies, but are in their pathways. But we're predominantly relying on technological change, and yeah, so we think that it's possible to get there. And we're just putting the final touches to the strategy, which the plan is that it will come out shortly before the COP26, which is the Conference of Parties, which is the thing that's going to be talking about what the world needs to do in order to ramp up its ambition for meeting net zero. Finally, and you'll be pleased to hear that I'm reaching the end of what I've got to say, a few reflections. Firstly, that behaviour change is really hard to model. It's really hard, it's particularly in the techno-rational model. One of the things that is also difficult is thinking about and helping our colleagues think about what are the go or no go points in the future. So at what point do we have to say, look, that technology is not going to be available to us in time? What are the alternatives? Talked about cost reduction and how that may alter things in future. Spatial and temporal disaggregation is really becoming very important to the government of the day, and yet our models are all based at national level. As you see, uncertainty, there are so many things that are uncertain. We think that Monte Carlo simulation is a bit of a busted flush, but that might be something that we need to come back to. The other thing that we know is that separating out the consequences of any individual change is really difficult, and particularly and what many of our customers want to do is to say, well, what's the overall effect of that? And we know that it's a package, so finding out how to separate out individual consequences of individual effects is a challenge for us, and one that we're exploring now. And finally, we are still rooted in the 20th century in terms of visualization of our models and choice, and what we really want to do as we move forward in time is to offer our customers both the ability to be able to interact with these kind of long-term strategic models without having to ask myself or one of my colleagues to run it for them, and also to be able to visualize in a powerful way the outputs. That's all I've got to say. So I'd say thank you. I hope there are still some people actually listening to that. And I'll stop sharing the screen now.
Yeah, thanks very much.
What did you log on to?
Sorry, can you just mute the microphone? Whoever. Thanks very much, Alec. That was really interesting. I think we have some comments. I think Graham Rand, who's the editor of Impact magazine, is in the audience, and he has made a comment about carbon calculators being in the next issue of Impact. So that's something to look out for in Impact magazine. With regard to questions, can I ask people to put the microphone on if they want to ask a question, and also put the video screen on so we can actually see you as well, if possible. So do we have any questions that are burning from anybody in the audience just at present from what Alec has told us?
I have a question, if I may. I'm sorry, I can't put my video in because I got my laptop screen down, so I'm sorry about that.
That's okay, Nick. Yeah.
But possibly the better way around. So hello again, Alex. Thank you for the presentation. I have a question, if I may, about embedded carbon, which I'm mindful that David Makai had some quite blunt things to say about. I guess the question in my mind is, you know, if we do all these things and yet we all buy 10 times as much stuff from China, and the power for that is all coal, then how does that affect really the UK's impact overall?
Well, perfect. Thanks, Nick. That's a really interesting question, and one that I get asked a lot. The first thing to say is that even if we think about embodied carbon, the UK is a very, very small consumer or producer of greenhouse gases relative to other economies like the US or China or India, for example. So one of the things that the UK decarbonised overnight and we were zero carbon tomorrow, we wouldn't, we're more about actually setting an example than actually decarbonising, because if our friends in America, China and the other really, really big emitters don't do it, then the world is going to be in a dark space. The second thing that you talked about was embodied carbon, and yes, that's important, but there's a but associated here. The way that we account for carbon is actually, and the carbon that we actually produce in this country, and that's been agreed internationally. So that's the accounting process that we've agreed internationally. So we can calculate embodied carbon. But because of the way that the UN and the like have agreed during the Kyoto protocols and all the rest of it to account for it, that we are accounting for the carbon that we emit here. I don't think that's a very satisfactory answer, but it's definitely one that that is the answer, really. I don't know that I can say anything else other than that, Nick.
Alec, I've got another question on the chat.
So I was going to say, Nick, if you are actually interested in embodied carbon, then there's some work by a guy called Professor Barrett at Leeds University. And the thing that sticks in my mind about embodied carbon, he showed you 2 pictures of, I don't know how old you are, but if you can remember the Mini that Alec Waterhouse produced and the Mini that BMW produced, his great line was, he said that BMW are twice as carbon efficient at producing Minis than British Leyland were. However, they produce exactly the same amount of carbon because the Mini that is produced now is twice as big as the Mini that Alec is. Oh, it's not very mini anymore. Anyway, right, enough on that.
That's it.
Thanks.
Alec, Stefan Ongo is asking a question. Stefan, do you want to ask a question to Alec, or do you want me to ask it?
I could read it, Stefan. That's a really interesting question about getting buy-in from policymakers about given the uncertainties. Well, a couple of things. One is that policymakers, without having any framework to do their modelling, would be are a bit stuck because it's so large and complex. So they generally like to have something that helps them. Over the years, and it's taken years rather than days and months, to help them trust what we're saying and believe that we can actually offer them some insights, has been
20 degrees
has been.
Sorry.
Change the schedule to 20 degrees.
Is it gone on?
Can you turn the
Put your real advance on the radiator.
can you mute, Deepak, can you mute your speaker? It's coming through. Thank you.
One of the other things I think that's actually happened was that has been that over certainly the time that I've been working in government, there's been an increase, and I think to a certain extent this is the effect of some of the big tech giants, is that the use of analysis has become, if you like, more everyday and therefore more acceptable. And our colleagues can see people using Google Analytics and the like, or talking about analysis in the public domain, and that's helped to set the expectation. So I don't think it's difficult to get buy-in. I think it's difficult to help them to understand the full range of uncertainty that is out there, particularly with scenarios. And I suppose I'll stop now because I'm babbling here, Stefan. I don't know whether that's helping or hindering you.
No, that's helpful, Alec. Thank you.
Okay, Barry, good to see you. Good to hear you again. How long does each model take to run? It's about it depends on how hard the algorithm has to work to find a solution back, and how much we turn up. We run this on the cloud, so we can turn up the processing speed a bit before we run out of money to do it. But it's about 20 minutes ago, which makes Monte Carlo a bit of a non-starter.
Hi, Alec. Can you hear?
Hello, Barry. Yeah, good to see you.
And you too. 20 minutes is faster than I thought. Have you considered working with some people in the Science Research Council who are offering help to speed up the running of models?
Yeah, we're working with we're working with a bunch of people at Edinburgh University, and also with the Met Office, who've got some quite big computers that have got a bit of spare capacity, and we might be putting them on there. There's a translation job to do first, though.
Understood. Okay. I was thinking of the Hartree Centre up here in the northwest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, indeed.
Okay.
I haven't spoken with them, but we have got. We're doing our best to. The question in my mind, Barry, was whether or not doing Monte Carlo on that is really going to be very helpful. What I do want to do, and what we want to do is to do. We were talking about helping our customers to visualize the solution space, and one of the thought experiments I thought was, I don't know if you've ever seen the Matrix, where you put on the Matrix goggles or the Google Glass, and you're then transported to looking at a map of the UK or some other schematic, and you've got a big play button in the middle of your head, and you go press play, and you can see the schematic of the UK decarbonising itself in front of you. So more wind farms being built, more trees being planted, etc. And if you decide that you don't like, you don't like the rate at which trees are being planted, or you want to up it, you can then go and turn a dial or something inside that solution space. Now, being able to do that and then run and see what go back to the beginning and rerun it as a user, these days you'd expect it to run almost in real time in front of your eyes, and even at 20 minutes, which is relatively quick, as you said. I don't think our users are going to be prepared to wait that long before they can see the results. So what we want to do is to do almost a full perm of all the run space that we've got. So we've got the solution space canned, and then when somebody presses the button and says, I want to do a particular something, that we can then just use it as a big lookup table to give them the answers rather than anything else.
I mentioned the Hartree because that's precisely the sort of thing they do. They have a big wall showing the interactive results of their parallel processing systems, mainly IBM based. And we saw an impressive demonstration of ray tracing and colouring a Bentley model. So they've been doing that sort of thing for Bentley.
Smashing.
Also a northern company. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, indeed. All right, Barry. One day we'll see each other. And I'm just running through the questions here. Richard de Glees was saying protesters emphasise the importance of home insulation. Does your model agree? Yeah, every run that we do says that before you start decarbonising home insulation, before you do much else for domestic consumption, you have to insulate our housing stock, particularly, for example, if you're going to use heat pumps, because heat pumps work a lot better when the thermal load on them is not quite as peaky as certainly the houses that we live in these days, most of which are relatively not as well insulated as they should be or could be.
Hey, it's John Ryan here. I'd like to say the house that I'm sitting in the moment was built in the 60s, and in the days when energy was cheap and other things. And the basic design we might call a semi-bungalow sort of thing, so that you've got the original build had sort of a vertical front and back going up to sort of just to the first floor. You know, two big side gables, one with one or two bathroom windows in, the other not, and a very steep roof. So you had some roof space for rooms in the roof, and in the roof with the addition of a dormer also. And the front and the back walls were more or less single sheet glass in wooden frames. And that's how it started. Now it's been altered since then, the double glazing and some sort of, it's been filling at the front, we built up the back a bit and so on. But one of the problems is that the inner skin of one of the gables is mostly, when the roof built, was something called breeze block. And to be quite frank with you, I don't have any idea of putting any kind of filling into that. You're going to get problems because the original design allows for humidity to be managed in a way by water vapor diffusing through the walls, through skins in and out, to manage it. And if you fill up the gap with some impermeable thing, then the experience of a daughter living in a more conventional semi is you'll end up with a nasty condensation problem, because effectively you're living inside a plastic bag. And unless you ventilate very well, you're going to have the problems of excessive humidity in the property. And to be quite frank, with this house in particular, we have done, things have been done to it. But if to make it, the one thing I don't want is anybody injecting any kind of chemicals into a wall, which is going to effectively that any vapors that come out of it come straight into the dwelling I'm trying to live in. Thank you very much. I don't want it. And so you've then got to think about possibly an exterior cladding mode of adding extra installation to the gables. And I think we don't go too far down that road before I start having arguments with family members that work for the HSC and why the certain tests weren't done. But in a way, probably the cheapest way to make this house is to the standard that a lot of people say it ought to have, is to knock it down and rebuild it. And I can't afford that. And I think a lot of other people are in that situation, unless they are in really affluent circumstances at the moment, or a government is prepared to be incredibly generous with the budget is already spent on the COVID and the furlough schemes and so on, then insulating to these standards is going to be somewhat an economical pipe dream. And it may very well be that you've actually got to look at things like how do you make your heat pumps more efficient, and to cope with the fact that it is cheaper to heat pump to warm an ill-insulated house than to stick with some other form of heating, because you're saying it's not ready for the heat pump treatment. The heat pump, if the heat pump is a better way of putting warmth into a building where it's wanted, then maybe we got to look at it regardless. As I say, because as I say, if you come, you're welcome to come and visit and have a look at the house, which is a bit of a mess because I just live in it by myself. But basically, I happen to remember, because of being interested in these things, I remember these houses being built and seeing what was going on around Formby where I live. The only other thing about Formby is that if you start digging a hole in the garden, you very quickly arrive at a water table. And it might be possible to do quite a nice job. I don't know.
John, is there a question coming?
Yes. How are you going to sort of plan with the really take a proper appraisal of the strategy about insulating? Just to say, as our speaker did, oh, we have to insulate houses. Perhaps it isn't quite a realistic thing to do as current thinking seems to be thinking. How are you going to really get a grip on how bad the problem is and how to do the insulating safely?
John, that was a very interesting, quite a long question, and one that I don't feel technologically prepared to capable to actually answer.
Well,
what I do know is that our scientists and technicians have been experimenting with the Building Research Council and others about how these kind of problems that you mentioned are and will be addressed in the future. And one of the things that the government of the day is going to need is to set up the policy instruments that will allow people such as yourselves to be able to, I think received wisdom is that if you insulate your home, you'll spend less on energy, but it's actually what you're facing is a short-term increase in cost for a long-term reduction in a long-term benefit over time, and turning that into a proposition that you as a consumer, rather than Homo economicus, is going to do the least cost benefit on. It's something that is exercising the policy developers in our organisation as we speak.
Alec, there's another question on the chat from Michael Charlton. I don't know if you've seen it, but if Michael's around, do you want to ask the question directly to Alec?
Thanks, Tony and Alec. I found that very informative. I'm not sure where that noise is coming from. It's not from my.
It's mine. It's my mouth just put a kettle on. Sorry, I'll just turn off mine.
Yeah, I don't know if my question made sense. It was. I think you referred to the fact that some of your customers are wanting to look at things in isolation, individual initiatives, and that struck me as perhaps quite frustrating, given all of the more complicated, joined up thinking that your modelling seems to achieve. Could you say a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, I can. If you can put up the kettle noise, you can. So it's funny. We're on the one hand, we have been asked by the Government Office for Science and for a lot of people to think about the whole system. And putting a whole system picture together is something that we've been spending a lot of time and effort doing. And yet, when you talk to people individually, they all want to know how much their bit contributes or how much their bit costs. It's a bit like eating a whole tin of beans and saying which one of those made you pass wind. But it doesn't stop people asking the question, and particularly our colleagues in Treasury, who they kind of want to be able to sort of draw a chart that shows every possible thing that you're going to do, how much carbon it's going to save for each of those possible things that you're going to do, attach a price tag to that, and then draw a line across that and say, well, we're willing to. Anything that costs less than X pounds per tonne of carbon, we'll take that, but we won't take some of these things. Take these other things that don't save much carbon, and some of the things that don't save much carbon might be building a hydrogen transmission network, which means that if you don't build that, you can't do any of the other things. And explaining that is something that we spend quite a lot of time doing. It's just part of life's rich pattern of being an analyst in the civil service, really. One of the things that we are experimenting with at the moment, there's a gentleman called Ian Staffel who works at Imperial College, and he's been using an approach that's based on Shapley values, and Shapley values come from game theory, and what they're looking at is how, again, it relies on a sort of Monte Carlo approach, but using the Monte Carlo approach, you can work out what a Shapley value is for each of the technologies, and then because normally the normal approach would be to take a whole system model like times, subtract one technology from it, see what difference it makes, and then keep on doing that. The problem when you do that is that once you've subtracted everything, and worked out what you think each of those contributions is going to be, if you add it all back up, it doesn't come to the amount, it comes to more than the amount that you get in the model, because they compete and interact with one another. So if you do it the other way around and add things in, you get it goes the other way, and then you've got to make some arbitrary assumptions about prorating and the like, and you very quickly get into some very redundant and arcane conversations, which I'm hoping that we can entice Instafel to show us how to do that on our models.
Yeah. Alec, I've got a question for you, which is, some of the stuff I read, it talks about optimize, electrify, and then decarbonize. And I'm just wondering, in your model, obviously,
what, Tony?
Well, optimize decarbonisation, I think.
Okay.
I think that's to optimize the process. So to optimize, you need to electrify, and then you decarbonize. So I'm just wondering, in the model, you've talked about hydrogen as part of it, and there's this discussion about blue hydrogen, which is sort of green hydrogen, which is blue, and how it's generated is important. Do you look at generation techniques for the solution in the decarbonisation process?
Yeah, we do. So we're looking at electrolysis, and one of the interesting things about that would produce green hydrogen. Carbon, cracking methane, which we've got quite a lot of, produces blue hydrogen, but then we're stuck with the dirty stuff. Friend of mine, yeah, with what to do with the carbon dioxide. So you've then got to have a carbon capture mechanism to take that away. But it's cheap to produce. And what we can see, what some colleagues in the hydrogen strategy have been talking about, and I think they're looking at the hydrogen strategy, says that I don't think that you could see many people who want the UK to progress further and faster on decarbonisation would dearly like to see no blue hydrogen, no coal being dug up, no gas being used as soon as possible. One of the things that we know as an economy, and I don't want to sound like an apologist for producing blue hydrogen, is that you actually have to create a demand for something. And if we've got the capability of producing hydrogen now and learning how to use it and deploy it, likewise with heat networks, the same thing. Heat networks supply heat. At the moment, if we can get the heat networks to work, we can actually switch them from being something that's carbon intensive to less carbon intensive. So at the moment, you could imagine a carbon emitting power source providing the energy for a heat network, and then you could turn that over to a water source heat pump or a nuclear power station or whatever. So there are stepping stones. This is about the way that humans work rather than what the technical pathways say. Yeah. And I'm certainly minded as I think you said about my prior existence. Very early on in my career, I was a gas engineer. And I'm minded, if you think about the way that gas grew up as a fuel inside the UK, we started off with making it from coal, well, all sorts of things, but coal. And those coal plants were producing gas for the area around them, predominantly for process load, for engineering, etc. And then there was a spin-off benefit. They were supplying houses and homes. And then we just connected all those together with the national grid. You could imagine a similar thing where we cut off parts of the network from natural gas, supply those with blue hydrogen or whatever sort of hydrogen we want, work out the logistics of making hydrogen. Don't forget that Nat Towns gas had a quite high hydrogen component. So everybody holds their hands up in horror. But if you look at the composition of Towns gas, it had a lot of hydrogen, a lot of carbon monoxide, and a little bit of methane. So we've got some form in that area.
Yeah, thanks. think there's a comment on the system from Stefan Ongo again, but I think it's just a comment really.
Yeah, I'm just saying, I've put a link to the Makai calculator. Just say that if you don't know, David Makai was our late scientific, was a scientific advisor in, chief scientific advisor in DEC. Sadly, he's no longer with us, but he was a great one for democratization of public policy development, and these calculators were his idea. So this latest iteration is named in his honor.
Yeah.
And if you haven't noticed, if you go into the 2100 mode, this is a next generation calculator, because you can change the start and finish one, all the ones prior, and any of the other ones you'll see in the world doesn't have the ability to change the start and finish. And the levels, you can have fractional levels, so you can have any value, any. It's not just integer values of the levels of ambition.
Yeah. Because there was a question earlier from Richard Eglis. About the protesters have emphasized on the importance of home insulations. Does your model agree? So I cheekily ran your model and then increase the home insulations.
Yep. And it makes a difference.
I'd like to ask a question. Or sorry, I've listened to the CCC. They're running a current run of 8 webinars, and I'm a member of the public, really, to be honest with you. And what the work they're doing to me was just knocked me out. It's really, really good work. What you are doing in the government, in the civil service, sorry, because we need to be careful there, is really, really good. I've been knocked out by what you're basically. In the past, I was feeling that we're not getting anywhere, but listening to the CCC webinars, listening to your talk today, is giving me optimism that there's a huge amount of work going on in the background. But when will it come out to the general public that we are doing something? Because I, as a member of the general public, are not aware of all this good work.
I suppose communicating about the model, you've got the calculator, that's one thing, it's not everything. You will, I'm pretty confident that certainly for transport that you will see, let me start again if I may, Declan. If we think about decarbonisation and you see how much the economy has decarbonised since we set those ambitions, that has mostly been in the world of electricity. So all of those wind turbines that you've seen everywhere, they're now those are the visible evidence of decarbonisation. It hasn't really touched too much on you as a member of the public, because all you're doing is turning on a switch and seeing electricity come out that looks exactly the same as, is exactly the same as what is before. I think the next phase that we're going to see, you will see much greater, as transport moves to electrification. I think that will probably be one of the first really visible changes to the way that you and me and all the rest of us who live in houses in the UK are going to, and that's going to happen in the next, I'm pretty sure that we'll see one of those kind of, it'll just kick over, and that's when you'll really see some things happening. But there are, I don't know, I mean, I'm glad you're interested in it, but certainly when I speak to colleagues, to friends around at the hockey club and the like, they're still very much of the view that as soon as I start talking about decarbonisation, I can see their eyes glaze over and they want to.
One of the speakers in the CCC this morning said that 80% of her friends have no idea what's happening. And she was wondering how we will help to make the public aware of all this. This is really good work what you're doing. I'm absolutely knocked out. I'm so pleased that we're in this position.
Well, we are thinking about it, and I think the UK government is unusual, and I saw some of my colleagues that it's certainly UK government in general is unusual, that it employs quite a lot of analysts inside government, whereas many other governments around the world have relationships with various other bodies and rely on theirs. What we're writing the tent with the policymakers, which is kind of helpful.
Thank you, Alex. That's brilliant.
Okay, we've got time for perhaps one or two questions, if anybody has any. Just while we're waiting for any questions to come forward, I've got another question for Alec, which is about policy, really, and how your models feed through policy making. And I'm just wondering how that process happens. And did anybody tell the government, perhaps in July, when they issued their statement on decarbonisation, that it might not have been a good idea to announce just around the same time that there would be no grants for electric cars?
So just could you repeat that? I just lost a bit of that question. Right.
Okay. I was just saying, how does your model get into the policymakers' hands and the process? What do they take from it? What's the process of you getting your models in front of the policy makers themselves?
Okay, right. So if we're talking about an individual policy, then there's a sort of the way that it's written down and what actually happens. And the way that it's written down is that there will be a statement of the rationale for making a particular policy, and then we would carry out, we would look at the different means for achieving that particular end. We would set up and do the analysis to work out what was the best for UK PLC, make that recommendation to our policy colleagues, who would then make the recommendation to the ministers and set it up.
Right.
In practice, quite often there's a dynamic in here that makes it sound as though it's a sort of linear process. It never is, and oftentimes our not oftentimes, but the work that we're doing is quite often numeric and analytical, and needs to take into account things that we don't consider in our models, and the politics of the situation as well. So we do certainly, all of our customers are incredibly keen on understanding what how we think the world will work. They challenge our assumptions and challenge our models quite heavily, particularly if they don't believe the answers, which is really good. When they've satisfied with that, then we will carry out something called an impact assessment, which you can see impact assessments published.
Yeah.
And usually those have got the analysis in there that supports what the government's position is on a particular policy. When you're saying sometimes you get announcements that on the one hand, on one part of the forest, they say one thing, and another part of the forest, they say another thing.
Yeah.
I think you're talking to an organisation that, is a federated organisation. And it's really difficult. I mean, at Number 10 and the Cabinet Office try to make sure that we're coherent. They have regular, they call them grid slots, where make sure that all the announcements are all coherent and they all add up and they're making sense to the public as a whole. Sometimes that doesn't work, just because of the nature of things.
Yeah. Okay. Have any more questions popped up from anybody?
Nick Yates, I have another question, if I may.
Yeah.
Just a question, please, Alec, about it was one of the dynamic dispatch model, perhaps, where you mentioned the price drop of wind. So yeah, the CFD's gone down, but my question was, what about all the other system costs? So you happen to have thermal on standby for when the wind drops in Scotland at 5 minutes, you need gigawatts at 5 minutes notice, and that has a cost. So is the broader system dynamic and cost within the model, was my question really.
The dynamic dispatch model doesn't deal very well with storage. So we're actively working on it to deal with storage at the moment. So, well, one of the things we do in Times, because it's got, for example, in Times, because it's got perfect foresight, because it knows what the energy demand is going to be, it never builds any storage because it knows what the future is.
Okay.
So what we've done is we've made some observations about what actually happens in the field, and we put a constraint in that forces an amount of extra capacity to be able to take into account the sorts of things that you're talking about and an amount of storage.
Yeah, the reason I asked the question is, as perhaps we've discussed previously, I worked on the Swansea Bay Lagoon. We commissioned Aurora Research, who already had a model to look at those broader costs. And so their model ascribed a higher value to predictability, for example. So that's kind of why it's in my mind.
Yeah, indeed. And I think certainly when you're doing these kind of discussions or trying to understand the value of different technologies, then assigning a value to intangible or tangible benefits is really hard. Really hard, Nick. I thought that for tidal, that the real problem was getting the amount of concrete that you'd need to pour in order to be able to build the lagoon.
To be honest, Alec, I don't think there was a pathway to cost reduction, because essentially there are a small number of very large bespoke projects. And while you can do some R&D, you don't make enough of them. If you're building wind turbines and you've got the R&D that the city will only accept a certain amount of R&D, and it's basically all your incremental ideas that your engineers know will work. And if you have a 3 to 5 year cycle period, you can bring the cost down very quickly. The lagoons, even nuclear power, they're very small. These are big, large. I can't see a clear R&D path to get to a competitive CFD. And I think that was the problem.
Yeah, and you don't get the price discovery. So certainly there's some people who are working at Oxford, a gentleman called Doyne Farmer. If you look up his name, you'll get the papers. And they were basically saying that you can fit an exponential decay curve to virtually any technology cost you like. But some of them are really, really flat, and their view was that the steepness of the exponential decay is in large part due to the scale of the size of the components that you're actually building. So if it's wind turbines, they're small, and as such, you discover quite a lot of learning by doing very quickly. Whereas if you're building very large things, as you say, Nick, the opportunity for learning, because you're doing them in big lumps, is quite small.
And civil engineering is quite risk averse, as you might hope, of people building bridges and railways and roads. You'd open to be quite risk averse.
I remember doing the calculations on concrete and things like that myself, where we do all the calculations and then multiply it all by 3.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Right, okay. Thanks very much, Alec. I think we've exhausted the questions at the moment, unless anybody has any. But I'd like to thank you very much for an excellent presentation. I think it was very informative, lots of detail, and certainly some homework to do for those that are interested to go away and do some more reading about some of the issues that you've talked about. So that's fantastic, really. So
it's a pleasure joining you, and I wish I could have been with you in person, particularly with Barry and some of the others that I've known and worked with over the time. But such is COVID life. And if Graham's still there on the call, Graham, I met one of your friends on holiday. I forget her name, but she was walking on the coast, and it's a very, very small world, because I told her what I did, and I said that my first ever course on operational research was with you up in the Lake District.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Anyway, on that note, I shall stop.
I don't know if Graham's still there. I think he might have departed on that one. Yeah. Oh, well. All right. Thanks very much, Alec. Will the slides be available afterwards, Alec?
I'm going to have to just go and double check what I've actually put in them. But yeah, if they are, I'll make them available.
Well, yeah. Take stuff out that.
But you've recorded it. You've recorded it anyway, so pretty much. So. It's
right.
It's all there.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's absolutely fine. Sometimes people ask for the slides. That's the thing with our meetings. So thanks to everybody in attendance. I'd just like to make a couple of announcements before we close. Number one, anybody who's attended today and is not a member of the OR Society, we'd invite you to join. There are many benefits. I have a slide somewhere that tells you the benefits, but I won't display it right now. I don't think I can, actually. Anyway, I can't. Yeah, no, I can't at the moment. But somewhere I have a slide. So if you want to contact me, I can tell you about the benefits. Certainly, you can join us at one of our future events as well. We have another meeting which is due on October the 27th, and that is hopefully going to be a live event. It's a great shame today couldn't be a live event, and we could have had a pint of beer or something afterwards. That would have been very nice indeed. But our next event on October the 27th should be in Manchester, all being well, and it's at GCHQ. So in the new Manchester site. So hopefully we'll be able to go ahead with that one, and look forward to any of you attending if you wish to. But look out for the invitation and sign up. And that's it really from me. Anybody else from the committee got to say anything about anything at this point?
No, other than to echo your thanks to Alec for a really enjoyable and informative presentation. So that's about the only thing I'd like to echo.
Thanks very much, Nick. Indeed. So thank you again, Alec, and to everybody who attended as well. So bye for now. See you at the next meeting.
Yeah, goodbye from me. It's goodbye from him. Goodbye.
Goodbye.